Hi everyone, my name is Robin Brown from Waste is My Resource. Today I'm going to show you how to use a compost cone like this one in front of me with a clear display panel. You'll be able to see how I add the different ingredients. The purpose of this compost cone is to divert your organics. That means your food waste, your green waste, or paper and cardboard. Eventually we'll have a wonderful pliable black mixture that can be added to your garden soil as a soil improver. It is full of microbes and visible critters that help break down the compost further and provide a better water holding capacity and provide food and disease resistance to your plants. That's the most important reason to compost. Number 2 reason is to keep organic waste out of landfill. 50% of most people's bin is organic, and when sent to landfill produces harmful methane in the anaerobic conditions of the landfill. We need 2 major groups of organics to make a compost. On the left hand side I've set up my greens group, and the ones on the right are roughly grouped into browns. There are some exceptions to these group names. We'll go back and focus again on the greens group. They're mostly our nitrogenous materials. The browns are our carbon materials. The secret to composting is that we need to balance the greens and browns on the nitrogen and carbon materials for the microbes to be happy and efficient in how they break down the organics. The organics will still break down even if you only add one type of material, but it will take a long time. So it's best to try and get the balance right at the start. If we get this cone firing along, you should be able to get your compost broken down and out into the garden in 8 weeks in summer or 12 weeks in winter, as the microbes tend to go to sleep in winter. Now going back to the greens, the things you can see are in the display in front of you. I use weeds and old veggies from the garden, like my old pumpkin vines and the sweet potatoes that I just had to pull out. I also have access to a lot of horse manure. You might have access to other types of animal manures, and that's fine. They're nitrogenous. You'll notice the horse manure is one of the exceptions I was talking about. It's brown, not green like the others, but it is high in nitrogen, so it sits in the green group. I also have some other materials in the plastic containers that you might have access to. Everyone has a lot of food scraps. I have chickens and dogs, so I have to share it with them, unfortunately. There are no exceptions for the food that can go in a compost bin. Microbes aren't fussy, like vermicompost worms. The rule of thumb is that if the objects or the materials were alive once, they can go in the bin. Now on to my browns. I have a lot of straw, and I also have a lot of gum leaves. You'll notice in these gum leaves they're really rich and black. So these have come from a bag where I compost them down in old horse cube bags, trying to replicate what you see in the bottom of the forest. I also have access to wood chips, as I have my own shredder, and I use branches from trees in the paddock, and I make a coarse wood chip mix. Great for the compost as it encourages fungi. Now some people will have access to a lot of shredded paper, and that's fine. Just remember that it isn't as dense as wood chips. Wood chips is like 80% carbon, whereas newspaper is down as 20%, and so you'll have to use a lot more than you would of wood chips, or vice versa. You'll have to add a lot more of that paper to absorb wet materials. So now we're starting our layering. Some people refer to composting as like making a lasagna. So it doesn't matter what you start with your layers, but you need to go nitrogen material, then carbon material. So in go my old pumpkin vines, in go the sweet potatoes and any weeds that you've just pulled out. Now if you don't like weeds coming up, then you can cut the weed seeds off, but I don't really mind because I just find it's all carbon in the end, and and that we won't worry about it. So the next thing goes in is the straw, and so I've got my green layer and my brown layer, and that's also helping absorb moisture. You pack that down a little bit. Now going back to my green side, and this time in goes the horse manure. So you might ask, how much do I put of each one each time? It really just depends on what you've got, but don't put any more than about 20 centimetres at the very most of any one material. The microbes like diversity, just like we do in our diet, and it also prevents it from packing down and becoming hard and not preventing water going through. So it's really important that you do vary what goes in your compost bin. So over to the carbon side, now I'm putting the wood chips in. It's really good to use wood chips if you can get hold of them. Coarse the better. It doesn't matter if they don't all break down in the process in that 12 weeks. They can go into your garden solid, because they do provide and attract fungi. And as I mentioned, fungi is one of the 4 microscopic critters that are really important to plant life. Don't be, as I mentioned, don't be too concerned if you've got solid pieces. They'll break down. Mother Nature sees to that. And now I've got a bit of a saying that wood is good in your garden. So we've now got quite a few layers in there, and soon we're going to be mixing them up. I'm going to put a little bit more in there. First of all, we'll put some food scraps in. Now, if you've got really squishy food scraps, like you've got a lettuce that's just decomposed and it's quite watery, then be aware that you don't want it to get too wet. So when you put the next lot of carbon in, put a bit more than you normally would to absorb it. So you have to remember, and that's where I've got my trusty photographer to focus on, the 4 elements of what is very important in a compost bin. So we need food, heat, water and air. And we've provided the food. We've got a bit of heat because the microbes, as they eat the food, they also eat each other. They create the heat. We've added water through the nitrogenous material, although in summer when it gets a bit hot you might find that it is getting dry, so you need to take your watering can out and water it. A bit of a rule for that is compost should always feel cold. If it doesn't feel cold, then it's too dry and you're going to have a few problems, which we'll talk about. You shouldn't be able to squeeze water out of it because then it's too wet, but it should feel quite cool or cold to touch with your bare hands. So that's the general rule of thumb. Now the microbes need air, and that was my last one of my signs there. And the best way of providing it in a compost cone like this is my little tool that I've got there is going to provide a way of putting air into there. It's a compost spiral, and you can get those from most hardware stores, and it enables you to mix the layers, which we want to do to help with the breaking down process, and it also allows you to get some air into that compost bin, because what we're trying to breed in the compost bin are aerobic microscopic creatures. They're the ones that are beneficial to the garden, and they do need air. So when you use this compost spiral, the idea is to wind it and then fluff it up. Now, if you tried to fill that whole bin, which is nearly a metre high, and you tried to lift all of that up, it gets quite heavy. So only ever go down 20 to 30 centimetres at a time and then fluff it and lift it up. Now, children love to do this, so in schools this is one of their favourite activities, and if you've got young children they'll always love to do that. You can't overdo this. You can't get enough oxygen in there. So if you had enough time to do it every day, then that would seriously help break down that food. But if you haven't, that's fine. A couple of times a week will fix the problem. We'll get the oxygen in. Now, the best part about doing this is that you are checking on your compost bin. And you are checking to see if there are any problems. Because one of the issues that I find with compost is that people set and forget. You can do it to a certain extent with compost cones, but while you leave it and there is an issue of too much moisture or it's too dry, then the problem becomes bigger. So another problem that you can develop is if you live near a river or a wetland, then rats could be an issue, and all you have to do is lay down a fine piece of avery wire, or even that fine netting that I have behind me around that garden. Lay that on the ground and then put the compost bin on top of that and curl it up around the sides, and you won't have a problem with rats getting in there. You might have, if it wasn't a wet problem, then you might have a problem where it's a little bit too dry, and the way that you can see that straight away is that you will have ants or something running around in your compost bin. Now you keep going until you fill your entire bin, but if you've only got enough on that day, then that's fine. And I always put a cover over the top so that when I lift the lid off, the microbes aren't exposed to the light. They really like to be in the dark, and in fact if they're left in the light, if they are exposed to the light for too long, they'll die. So as part of the normal breakdown process, you are going to find creatures in that compost bin when you lift the lid off. You'll see, definitely on the surface, you'll see slaters, perfectly normal. They particularly like wood chips. You'll see cockroaches. They're also going to be on the top layer as part of the breakdown. And you'll see these little white things running around called springtails. Now sometimes if you lift the lid off and your compost was a bit wet, you will get a whole lot of little flies that fly out. You might think they're midges, but they're called vinegar flies. Now they're absolutely a normal part of the composting, but if there were too many, it probably means that that's too wet. And what you'll have to do is leave the lid off for a couple of days, and that will help dry it out. At the end of the 2 days, if it's still a bit smelly, you can put a whole lot of wood chips on the top, about 20 centimetres, or about 20 centimetres of shredded paper, and then you get your compost spiral again, and you would flip that up. So now I'm showing you what to do and how to actually harvest the compost. So we've waited 8 to 12 weeks. That was very quick, but I've taken it to another part of the garden where I've got another little compost bin that I'm setting up because I'm growing some bananas in a circle, and I wanted to make sure that the ground had lots of good food in here. So I set this little compost bin up that I made from a rubbish bin that someone gave to me, and I just cut the lid out and left that for 8 to 12 weeks for it to break down. And just for the purpose of today, I'm actually going to take this off in a moment and show you what it looks like, and I'm going to move it to the side and set it up again so that I can continue to put more compost down for my bananas. What you'll see, you have to sort of pull. Of course those big compost cones are a little heavier to pull than this little one, but you shake that around and you'll be able to lift that up fairly easily. And I describe this as my compost cake, and it's a little more obvious when you've got a bigger one, but if you look closely there, you'll see the bottom layer for about 10 centimetres is quite dark, and then in the middle you've got a middle third where you can see the odd bits and pieces of shells and a few sticks and things that are breaking down, and on the top you've got a layer where everything is like it was when it was first put in there. Now if you really needed to refurbish your soil, you could take that whole pile to your garden, dig a trench and put it in. But if you like just using that dark black crumbly material, then just get a garden fork and scoop the top layer off. So you can scoop the whole layer that's not processed at all, or you could then go into the transition layer and put that in as well. So I'm just setting up my new bin alongside of the existing one. So eventually we'll get down to that really black crumbly mix that we want to put in the holes of all the plants that we are going to be putting in my next garden bed, and I'm going to show you that in a moment in the next video. So what I'm going to do now is just pack that into a bag so I can carry it to my new garden bed that I'm setting up. But the interesting thing I'm going to show you here is what can happen in a very established garden like mine, because I've been here for many years. Tree roots will get into your compost bin if you don't pick it up before that 12 weeks. So 8 weeks is probably the maximum to leave it, and you notice there that it just makes, it's not going to ruin your compost, but it will just make it a little harder to pick it up with your fork, and you might have to separate some of those clods, but it's still rich and full of you'll find lots of earthworms and things like that in there, still lots of micro critters. So in a new suburb, we've got very few trees around. This is not going to happen, but if you're in an old suburb where you're trying to plant, this is what happens in a compost bin. Now that's why I have moved to raised garden beds, so that I don't have an issue, but that's a personal preference for people. So now I'm ready to move on, and I'm going to show you here in one of my raised garden beds, which is an old rowing scull. And my rowing club, they had a tradition of burning these boats when they were at the end of the life, and I decided that that wasn't very environmental, so I asked if I could have them, and I cut them up, and they make fantastic raised garden beds. So what I've done here, I've had a crop of apple cucumbers growing all summer, and now the soil's a bit depleted, so I've dug a trench all the way along the side closest to me, and I'm going to backfill with that compost that I've just brought over from behind that tree behind the garden. And some people use their compost as mulch, but I've already mentioned that UV light will kill the microbes, and you don't want to kill any that you can help, because all of those critters play a vital role with your plants, creating a symbiotic relationship to on the roots, and they produce nutrients or elements that are water soluble. So once I've put the compost in, I just backfill with the soil that I piled up on the other side and pack that down, so they're all under the soil. It was only about 10 centimetres deep, it wasn't very far. And then what I do is dig a trench back on the other side and put the remainder in there, and then I'm going to be putting some Asian greens in there, and they'll just love that because they'll put their roots straight down into that rich compost. So it's pretty easy really, nothing much to it, and I'd like